Have you ever met someone whose discipline was so extreme, it almost scared you? Not because they shouted or demanded perfection, but because they lived by a standard so unwavering, it made your excuses feel small. We often admire people who succeed, but what we rarely talk about is the pain behind their transformation, the heartbreak, the rejection, the moment they hit rock bottom and had no choice but to rebuild themselves. So let me tell you the story of Elias, not a celebrity, not a billionaire, not some motivational figure, just a regular guy, until life broke him in a way that turned him into something extraordinary. Elias was 23 when the world he'd built in his head came crashing down. He was madly in love with a girl named Lila. To him, she was everything, his best friend, his muse, his reason to wake up. They'd spent countless nights dreaming about the future. He'd promise her the world and she'd smile like she believed him. But there was a truth Lila saw in him that he didn't want to face. He talked more than he did. Elias was the kind of man who dreamed loudly and acted slowly. He'd tell everyone he wanted to start a business, to hit the gym, to become successful. But when morning came, he'd hit snooze. He had ambition, but not structure. Desire, but not discipline. And people can love your potential for a while, but eventually, they get tired of waiting for you to become it. One rainy evening, they sat in a small cafe where they'd often meet after work. Lila's tone was softer than usual, her eyes tired but kind. She stirred her coffee and said quietly, "Elias, I can't do this anymore." His heart sank. "What do you mean?" She looked up, her voice trembling. "You keep saying you'll change. You'll start. You'll improve. But you never do. You're comfortable dreaming, but terrified of doing. I can't build a future on your promises." Silence. That kind of silence that crushes your chest. Elias tried to laugh it off, to convince her it was just a phase, but she was done believing in potential. She stood up, left a few bills on the table, and walked out into the rain. And for the first time, Elias didn't chase after her. Not because he didn't want to, but because deep down, he knew she was right. That night, Elias went home and stared at himself in the mirror for hours. He didn't recognize the man looking back. Eyes tired, shoulders heavy, filled with regrets that had aged him years beyond his age. He thought about all the times he'd promised himself he'd start tomorrow. How tomorrow had become a graveyard for all his dreams. And how Lila's words, "You're not serious about life," echoed in his head like thunder. He couldn't sleep that night. Something inside him cracked. Not a breakdown, but a breaking open. Around 3 a.m., he got out of bed. No plan, no motivation video, no big speech. Just a moment of raw clarity. He whispered to himself, "I'm done losing to myself." It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. And that's where true discipline begins. Not in noise, but in silence. Not in motivation, but in pain. The next morning, he did something he hadn't done in years. He woke up early. Not because he had to, but because he said he would. He didn't start with huge goals. He didn't say, "I'll become successful." He just said, "Today I will keep my word." He made his bed. He exercised for 15 minutes. He planned his day. Small things, but after years of excuses, they felt like victory. Every task completed was a silent rebellion against his old self. Each morning, the voice of doubt got quieter. But make no mistake, discipline isn't a miracle. It's a war. And the enemy isn't the world, it's your weaker self. Elias soon realized that discipline isn't built on motivation. Motivation is emotional. It fades when life gets hard. Discipline is structural. It stays even when you're broken. At first, the 4:30 a.m. alarms were brutal. His body screamed for comfort, his mind begged for more sleep. But he kept remembering Lila's voice. "You talk, but you never follow through." So he made a deal with himself. "If I said it, I'll do it no matter what." No negotiation, no excuses. That one rule changed everything. Weeks turned into months. The world didn't cheer for him. No one clapped. No one noticed. And that's when he learned another brutal truth. Real discipline is invisible. People only see results, they never see the lonely mornings, the silent battles, the tears you hide behind progress. Elias stopped posting quotes online. He stopped telling people his plans. He just worked. The gym became his sanctuary. The early mornings became his church. The pain he once avoided became the fuel that drove him. Because when you stop fearing pain, you start growing beyond imagination. There was a night about 6 months into his new routine. When temptation almost won, a few friends invited him to a late party. The old Elias would have gone without hesitation, but he remembered something his inner voice whispered weeks earlier. Every yes to distraction is a no to progress. So he stayed home. He worked, he read, he planned. The next morning, while his friends slept in, he was up before sunrise. And in that stillness, he realized something powerful. The scariest level of discipline is not about effort. It's about consistency. Anyone can be disciplined for a day. Few can do it every day. That's what separates the ordinary from the unstoppable. But the universe always tests you when you start changing. After months of silence and improvement, Elias received a message one night. It was Lila. "Hey, how have you been?" His heart raced. For a moment, all his old emotions flooded back, but he paused. He didn't reply right away. He didn't need to, because the man she left wasn't the same man reading that message. He wasn't chasing love anymore, he was becoming someone worthy of it. That's when he understood a truth most never do. Discipline is not just about work, it's about emotional control. When you master discipline, you stop reacting, you start responding. You stop chasing, you start attracting. You stop needing approval, because you respect yourself enough not to beg for it. Still, Elias had his moments of weakness. Nights where loneliness whispered, "Why are you doing all this? For what?" But instead of running from it, he sat with it. He stared into the darkness and said, "I'm doing this because I refuse to live in regret." And that's when he started understanding something Stoic in nature. Discipline isn't about punishment. It's about peace. When you become disciplined, you no longer live at the mercy of mood or emotion. You rise above them. You become the master, not the servant of your mind. Weeks turned into seasons. Elias' body changed first, stronger, leaner, sharper. Then his habits followed, more productive, focused, calm. But the biggest transformation wasn't physical. It was spiritual. He was no longer controlled by desire or comfort. He had learned the most frightening truth about discipline. It's not about control, it's about freedom. Freedom from distractions, freedom from excuses, freedom from your weaker self. One winter morning, Elias met one of his old friends by chance. They hadn't spoken in a year. His friend looked at him and said, "Man, you've changed. You look different, like you've got your life together." Elias smiled and replied softly, "I just stopped lying to myself." That line stayed with me, because how many of us live in the illusion that we'll start someday, that we'll fix ourselves later? But later is the lie that kills dreams quietly. Elias stopped waiting for perfect timing. He realized the best time to start was when he felt least ready. Because discipline is born not in comfort, but in discomfort. Slowly, he started noticing subtle shifts. He no longer needed external validation. He no longer feared being alone. He no longer compared himself to others. He had built something few people ever do: trust with himself. Every time he said he'd do something and did it, that trust deepened. That's the foundation of terrifying discipline. It's not strength, it's self-trust. Because once you trust yourself completely, you become unstoppable. People started calling him cold, but he wasn't cold. He was focused. He had stopped explaining his journey to people who couldn't understand it. He wasn't trying to be better than anyone. He was trying to be better than who he was yesterday. That's the beauty and the terror of true discipline. It isolates you, but in that isolation, you discover your power. By the time Elias turned 25, he wasn't chasing dreams anymore, he was living them. He wasn't seeking love. He was radiating it through his purpose. He had learned that love doesn't come from finding the right person. It comes from becoming the right person. And that's what terrifying discipline does. It refines you until there's nothing left but truth. So let me ask you something. What if you decided today to stop negotiating with your weakness? What if just for the next week you kept every single promise you made to yourself? Imagine what would happen if you stopped seeking motivation and started creating consistency. If you stopped saying tomorrow and just did it today. That's the awakening of discipline. That's the first step toward the scariest level you'll ever see. Because the truth is, Elias's story isn't rare. It's inside all of us. We all have that moment where life breaks us open, forces us to rebuild, and dares us to rise. The only difference between those who stay broken and those who become unstoppable is discipline. And as Elias would say, discipline doesn't demand perfection, it demands consistency. Every single day, you're given two choices. return to your old habits, or rise toward your potential. One path gives you temporary comfort. The other gives you permanent power. So which one will you choose? Because this was just the beginning of Elias's journey. In the next chapter, you'll see what happens when discipline stops being a habit and becomes a way of life. Part 2, Becoming Unshakable. Have you ever met someone who's reached a point where nothing shakes them anymore? No anger, no heartbreak, no chaos, just calm, quiet power. That's not luck. That's not genetics. That's the final stage of discipline. The kind that looks frightening because it's rare. When Elias reached this stage, people said he'd changed. But the truth was he hadn't changed, he'd evolved. He'd gone beyond motivation, beyond emotion, and reached a state most people never touch: inner control. The year after his transformation began, Elias moved into a small apartment by himself. It was simple: one desk, one chair, a bed, and a journal. He wasn't running away from the world. He was stripping away everything that didn't serve him. The first few weeks were uncomfortable. Silence was loud. He'd wake up at 4:30 a.m. like always, but now the quiet was heavier. No notifications, no noise, no comfort to distract him from his thoughts. And in that stillness, something started to happen. He began to face his truth. We live in a world where distraction has become the new drug. People can't sit alone for 5 minutes without checking their phones, because silence forces you to meet the parts of yourself you've been running from. But Elias, he faced it head on. Every morning, he wrote 3 things in his journal. 1, what am I avoiding? 2, what am I grateful for? 3, what needs to be done no matter how I feel? Those 3 questions became his daily compass. They kept him grounded when emotions tried to take over. And slowly, something terrifying started to happen. He stopped needing motivation altogether. He didn't wake up because he felt inspired. He woke up because he said he would. That's the highest level of discipline, when you no longer depend on feelings to take action. Elias's days became like clockwork. Morning workouts, cold showers, journaling, work, reflection. To outsiders, it looked robotic, but to him, it was freedom. He wasn't a slave to moods or desires anymore. He had mastered himself, and people noticed. Friends started saying, "You're too serious now. You used to be fun." But Elias just smiled. Because the truth is, when you stop living for comfort, you stop entertaining mediocrity. And to those who are stuck in comfort, that looks boring. But here's what they didn't see. Elias was happier than ever. Not because life was easy, but because his mind was quiet. One evening, as he sat by his window sipping tea, he thought about the word discipline. People think discipline means control, but for him it had come to mean clarity. Discipline isn't about forcing yourself. It's about freeing yourself. Freeing your mind from chaos, freeing your heart from drama, freeing your soul from everything that steals your energy. He realized that the scariest level of discipline isn't the power to control your body. It's the power to control your reactions. Because once you stop reacting emotionally to everything, you become untouchable. And then, life tested him again. One afternoon his phone rang, and it was Lila. After 2 years, the voice he'd once craved echoed through the speaker again. "Hey," she said softly. "I've been thinking about you lately. Can we talk?" Elias didn't feel anger or nostalgia, just calm. He agreed to meet her. They sat at the same cafe where it all ended years ago. She looked at him for a moment and said, "You've changed. You seem so peaceful, like nothing bothers you anymore." He smiled gently. "Because nothing outside me controls me anymore." She looked down, playing with her cup. "I regret how things ended." He paused, not to punish her, but because he was choosing his words carefully. "Don't," he said finally. "It was supposed to happen. You leaving forced me to meet the real me." There was no resentment, no pain, just gratitude. Because discipline had taught him something that heartbreak never could. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's understanding that peace is more valuable than pride. When he walked out of that cafe, something inside him felt final. He realized that the greatest victory wasn't getting her back. It was getting himself back. That's what happens when you reach the scariest level of discipline. You stop chasing closure. You become it. You stop needing people to understand you. You start understanding yourself. Over time, Elias began mentoring younger colleagues at work. They'd ask, "How do you stay so consistent even on bad days?" And he'd answer, "Because I stopped chasing motivation and started building systems." He explained that emotions are like the weather, unpredictable and temporary. But discipline is like architecture, stable and designed. He showed them how he planned his days. Every task timed, every habit tracked, every distraction eliminated. Some called it obsession, but obsession with growth isn't dangerous. Obsession with comfort is. Months passed and Elias's reputation grew quietly. He was promoted not because he was the loudest or the most charming, but because everyone knew. If Elias said he'd do something, it would get done. That's the invisible power of discipline. It earns respect without noise. But while his external life flourished, something deeper was happening inside. He was learning the rare art of emotional detachment. He wasn't emotionless. He simply stopped letting emotions dictate his actions. If someone disrespected him, he didn't explode. If someone ignored him, he didn't chase. If someone doubted him, he didn't explain. He had mastered the pause. And in that pause, wow, there was power. There was a time he walked into a meeting where a senior manager criticized his work unfairly. The old Elias would have felt insulted, maybe even fought back. But he just listened, nodded, and said, "Thank you for the feedback." That night, instead of stewing in anger, he improved what needed fixing. Weeks later, the same manager commended his progress. Elias didn't gloat. He just smiled to himself. Because that's what discipline does. It teaches you to turn ego into fuel. But the higher you rise in discipline, the more isolated you become. People start misunderstanding your calm for arrogance, your silence for coldness, your peace for indifference. Elias felt that too. Friends stopped calling. Some said he was too serious and too focused, but he didn't take it personally. Because he'd learned that most people aren't uncomfortable with your success. They're uncomfortable with what your discipline reminds them about themselves. Your consistency exposes their excuses. Your focus highlights their distractions. And instead of improving, they distance themselves. One evening, as he walked home after a long day, he passed by a group of his old friends from years ago. They were still doing what they'd always done, drinking, complaining, repeating the same stories about dreams they never started. They invited him to join, laughing and shouting. For a second, nostalgia hit him. He remembered being one of them, full of laughter but empty of direction. But he also remembered the pain that came with it, the wasted time, the regret, the mediocrity. He smiled, waved, and kept walking. Because discipline had taught him another painful truth. You can't take everyone with you. Some people love you only as long as you stay the same. The moment you grow, you become a mirror they can't face. Over time, his solitude became sacred. He started to enjoy being alone. Mornings became meditations. Evenings became reflections. And in that peace, he found something extraordinary, a clarity. He realized how much of his old life had been noise, how much of his old habits were distractions disguised as fun, and how beautiful it felt to wake up every day with purpose, not panic. That's when he understood what true power is. Peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. Years later, Elias achieved everything he once dreamed of. Financial stability, health, self-respect, but he wasn't attached to any of it. Because the true reward wasn't the success. It was who he became through the process. He had become unshakable. Unshakable in his habits, unshakable in his emotions, unshakable in his peace. And that's what makes the scariest level of discipline so rare. It's not about what you gain, but what you no longer need. You stop needing approval. You stop needing attention. You stop needing everything that used to control you. You finally become enough for yourself. One morning, while journaling, Elias wrote something that summed up his entire journey. Discipline isn't about controlling life. It's about aligning with it. The more you master yourself, the less you need to master anything else. He realized that most of life's suffering comes from resistance. Resisting the work, resisting the discomfort, resisting the truth. But once you stop resisting, once you surrender to growth, discipline stops feeling like a cage and starts feeling like freedom. Years after his journey began, Elias returned to that cafe once more. Not to relive memories but to close a chapter. He sat by the window, the same seat where he once felt broken. But now he smiled, because that heartbreak had been his greatest teacher. He thought about how people fear discipline because it looks hard, but the real fear should be living without it. Drifting through life controlled by impulses, never truly knowing peace. He looked around at people scrolling through their phones, chasing distractions, and whispered under his breath, if only they knew how peaceful it feels to be in control of yourself. That's when he realized, discipline isn't a skill. It's a relationship in between you and your potential. Every time you keep your word, You build trust. Every time you break it, you damage it. And the stronger that trust becomes, the more powerful you feel. Because true confidence doesn't come from what you have. It comes from knowing that if everything was taken away, you'd still have the power to rebuild it through discipline. So let me ask you something. What if you reached that level? What if nothing could shake your peace? Not heartbreak, not rejection, not failure. What if your emotions stopped being your master and started being your messengers? That's what the scariest level of discipline looks like. It's not intense workouts or waking up early. It's mastering the space between stimulus and response. It's being able to say, I don't react anymore. I choose. You see, the world will always try to pull you back into noise, into comparison, into chaos, into comfort. But the disciplined one, they move differently. While others chase trends, they chase purpose. While others crave validation, they crave growth. While others seek control over others, they seek control over themselves. And that's why the truly disciplined look terrifying to the undisciplined, because they represent everything we know we could be. If only we stopped running from discomfort. By the time Elias turned 30, he had everything he once thought he wanted, but he no longer cared for the spotlight. He understood that real strength doesn't shout, it whispers. It's not seen, it's felt. When people met him, they couldn't explain it, but they'd always say the same thing. There's something different about you. You feel grounded. And he'd simply reply, it's peace. You just haven't felt it yet. So if you've made it this far, let this be your reminder. Discipline is not the enemy. It's the path to your freedom. It will cost you comfort, friends, distractions, and easy pleasures. But in return, it will give you clarity, confidence, self-respect, and peace. That's the trade-off. And once you experience that level of peace, you'll never go back to chaos again. Because the scariest level of discipline is not about perfection. It's about consistency. It's about control without force. It's about living in a way where your actions serve your values, not your impulses. And when you finally reach that point, you'll realize something powerful. You don't need to chase success. You just need to become the kind of person who naturally attracts it. So if you're ready to start, do what Elias did. Wake up tomorrow and do what you said you'd do, no matter how you feel. Don't wait for motivation. Don't look for validation. Just keep your word again and again and again. Because one day, someone will look at you and say, I've never seen discipline like that before. And they'll have no idea how much pain, solitude, and courage it took to become that way. But you'll know, and that's all that matters. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.